Hi, my name is Peter Eichens, and I'm coming today from East Carolina University. I'm a doc student there, getting my PhD in, I think it's now rehabilitation counseling and supervision. They just changed the name, but it's counselor education rehabilitation. I did my master's work at St. Cloud State University in clinical psychology with an emphasis in rehabilitation. And I also got my bachelor's there. St. Cloud State's a small university up in northern Minnesota. That's where I did most of my training, and that's where I got most of my experience from. But today, what I'm going to be talking to you about is queer competency. And while I was doing my master's work, I became the graduate assistant for the LGBT Resource Center on campus. And what we would do as a part of my work is what's common on most college campuses, which are safe space trainings. So that's just really basic. You meet with the faculty and some students, and you go over some policies and some terminology for students on campus, and professors to teach them the importance of having a safe space. But as I was going through my master's work and learning about counseling, specifically rehab counseling, I began to see more of a need in the field. As somebody who's gone through different kinds of treatment and counseling and personal experiences that I've had, I know that this was a need, or knew this was a need. So we expanded this to focus more exclusively on counseling and rehabilitation counseling. So what began as a safe space training expanded into trainings for all the rehab offices in Minnesota and those rehab counselors, and then the community mental health providers that worked with them, and some addiction treatment centers and direct support professionals. It really just kind of took off from there because there was such a huge need for this information. So that's kind of how I got here today, and I've continued that work at East Carolina and hope to continue it for my dissertation. But the focus here is queer competency. So what exactly does that mean, and what is that going to look like today? And a lot of it has to do with an understanding of the queer community, having awareness of how you feel about working with queer communities, but also having an understanding of your own sexual orientation development, gender identity development. Where does that come from? What makes you uncomfortable? There's still some divisiveness within this topic, especially in our political climate today. So hopefully what this presentation does is just give you a different perspective of how to approach this information in this population that can hopefully help provide some more affirmative training, or affirmative counseling, affirmative identity, affirmative support for whoever you're working with. All right, so as we go through today, I'm hoping what you get out of this is a solid differentiation between these different parts of our identity. They're often conflated and confused, but I'm going to hopefully clarify some of these concepts for you today: biological sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, expression, sexual behavior. I want you to hopefully appraise your conscious and unconscious biases regarding the queer community and about sexual orientation and gender identity, exactly what they mean. It's going to be different for everybody. And then develop an awareness around some disparities and some specific issues that some of our queer consumers might have. So what happens when you have a disability on top of being queer, and what does that look like? All right. So to get started, I know some of you are going to be listening at home, but for the people in the room, and I would like to just kind of think about this too in terms of talking about these topics that might be a little bit uncomfortable. A really easy acronym you can use is PLEDGE. I like to use this before all my trainings or whenever I speak at a conference, just to get us all on the same page, get us comfortable about talking about something that might feel uncomfortable to you. So PLEDGE. P, participate at your own comfort level. For the people in the room here and for you, whoever is watching, I'm going to be doing different activities as we go throughout this presentation, and I want you to play along. You know, the more you put into this, the more you'll get out of this, and it's really an exploration of yourself and your experiences and the people you know and the people you've worked with. So please participate at your own comfort level. L, listen actively to others. This is for the people in the room, but this is also for whenever you engage in these kind of conversations with your consumers or in the workplace with your coworkers. I hope these conversations continue outside of these kind of training spaces. We need these conversations to happen in more environments than just the one that we're in right now today. E, experiment with new ideas. Hopefully I can teach you at least one new thing today. This is going to be a long training, and I'm going to be throwing a lot of information at you, but hopefully you can pull something from it that can help. And I encourage you to continue educating yourself beyond this. The LGBT or queer community is always evolving and changing, so it's important to continually update ourselves on what is happening with these consumers or with the queer population. Don't judge. So there's a lot of different opinions and a lot of different belief systems that people are coming from. And it's important for me, for somebody who facilitates this information, to respect all perspectives and have empathy for wherever somebody is coming from. And I encourage you to do the same, because we don't know why people think the way they think, and we don't know why people believe the things that they believe, but they do, and we shouldn't devalue them just because we don't agree with them. G, get the most out of the program. Again, the more you put into this, the more you'll get out of it. So please, I encourage you to participate and enjoy yourself. Hopefully this isn't too painful. All right. So a little bit about the word queer. The presentation is called Queer Competency, and for some of you that might seem a little strange because queer has traditionally been used as a very derogatory term to refer to somebody within the LGBT community, and it still can be continued to be used in that way today. However, queer has also become a reclaimed word by the community and within academia, and that started back in the feminist movement of the 60s and 70s. So queer can now be considered an umbrella term, which encompasses the larger like LGBT, TTQQIIAA plus community, and it could just be plus because there are so many different identities that people are claiming for themselves to describe their sexual orientation and gender identity development. So queer is a simple way for you to be inclusive when referring to this population and referring to sexual and gender minorities. I want to be as inclusive today as possible. It'd be extremely challenging to talk about every single group, so that's why I'm going to use the word queer. And again, within academia, if you ever want to continue your research outside of this, it's completely appropriate to look for things like queer film, queer theory, queer literature, queer studies. Queer has become the academic term to define this movement in this community. Along with the word queer, throughout this presentation and this PowerPoint, you're going to see me using pronouns they, them, theirs when I'm referring to a singular person. And that might be confusing to some people, but I'm doing that intentionally to be inclusive. And I try to do that as much as possible whenever I'm referring to anybody, just because I'm trying to be respectful of whatever their true pronouns might be without assuming that I know. So I keep it nice and neutral throughout this presentation, if it's confusing to you. It's not grammatically correct, but the rules are changing a little bit, so get comfortable with that. All right, so now for an activity that we're gonna be doing here and then at home, what I want you to do is I'm gonna be showing photographs on the screen or on this PowerPoint. You're gonna be seeing a photograph. And I want you you can say it out loud, you can write it down, or you can just think it. What are the first things that come to mind when you see the photograph? And I encourage you to say it out loud, even at home, because it's powerful to say it out loud, because we usually think something different than what comes out of our mouth. And I think it's important for you to verbalize it. But I want you to pretend like you're describing this photo to somebody who's not able to see it. Okay? So describe it the best that you can. I also tell people to think of this like, go back into the mind of a child. How would a child describe this photo if they had to? All right? So for this first photo, how would you describe this to somebody who couldn't see it?
Female.
Female, okay.
Black woman with tattoos.
Black woman with tattoos. Black woman, okay.
Baseball hat backwards.
Baseball hat backwards.
Lots of bling.
Okay, you're noticing the bling. Okay, so we got the baseball hat, color of the skin.
Like she's having fun.
She looks like she's having fun. She does, she looks like she's a good time.
Pretty hair.
Yeah, nice long hair.
Her hair's two different colors.
Her hair is two different colors. Yeah, you got the black and the blonde.
Some tattoos.
Got some tattoos. Questionable tattoos. No, they're all right. And some eye makeup. Attractive. Okay, sure. Yeah, she looks like a good time. Usually what people say is they notice the color of the skin, so they say it's a black woman or a female. Talk about her long hair. You know, she's got this bling, she's got this jersey on, the backwards hat, kind of punkish, kind of tomboyish a little bit. But yeah, good, that's her. All right. So just take a few seconds looking at this one.
Something cute male.
Okay, so 20-something cute male.
Looks sad.
He looks sad, yeah.
He looks sad.
I always say he looks sexy. I always say he's kind of like he's brooding a little bit. I don't.
Maybe sad wasn't the right word.
No,
Contemplative.
Yeah. I don't know what he's looking at.
They're naked from like the chest up,
Yeah,
laying down on something.
at least half naked.
Yeah.
It's like a massage. You're gonna get a massage today.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe he's just relaxed. Really pretty cheekbones.
Yeah.
Very well groomed. Nice lips.
His hair.
Nice hair, yeah. Pretty. White. I'd assume white. Good.
Eyeliner maybe? Just nice eyelashes.
Maybe a little eyeliner. All right, just take a few seconds. So how would you talk about this one?
Red hair, blue jacket with a red tie, white shirt.
He looks like a pop star.
He looks like a pop star.
Like David Bowie.
Yeah, I've heard some David Bowie before. I've heard Edward Cullen before. Really vibrant colors, vibrant hair. Traditional kind of man suit. Maybe a little angry. All right.
I noticed the long fingernails.
Yeah.
The first thing I noticed.
Almost like manicured fingernails.
Why is that the first thing you noticed, do you think?
I don't know. That just what popped out.
So I see the cheekbones, cleft chin. Luscious lips.
How would you describe this to somebody who couldn't see it?
Kind of androgynous. Okay.
These pronounced eyebrows.
Not quite sure. So you notice
Hair
the,
comes back.
yeah, the hair's nice and back, it's coiffed, eyebrows done up, nails, lips. Strong chin.
But with a vest, white shirt, red tie.
Yeah. Yeah, so up it's a little bit more feminine, and then down here it's more masculine, traditionally masculine. If you saw the rest of this photo, they're wearing red fishnet like panties, or stockings and panties, and then red heels. So they're really messing with their expression of gender, this person. All right, last one.
I actually recognize him. That person from some photos.
Okay, you recognize him. Yeah.
Facial hair.
Okay. So he's got facial hair.
Tattoos across their chest, muscular,
Yeah, really built. This like a brick house. This one.
big forehead,
Yeah.
short hair.
I did this for some PT students, and immediately one of them started to go, "Well, his left clavicle is just a little bit." Like, no, don't think about that. Focus on how would you describe this person?
It's pretty. It's a pretty.
Yeah,
face.
pretty.
Yeah.
I know. I just was.
Young.
All these people were kind of young. I might need to change that up a little bit. All right. So now going back through, we're going to talk about who these people are. And they're all real people who have talked about their gender and some of them their sexual orientation publicly and their pronouns. So that's why I chose to focus on these ones in particular. So this first person, their name is Angel Hayes, and they identify as being agender. So the prefix A means lack of. Anytime you're curious about what one of these words mean, just look at the prefix of it, and that will kind of give you a clue as to what this person is trying to express when they say that I am this. And in Angel's case, it is I am agender. So when we saw Angel originally, we, as most people do, we think right away, she, her, hers, her long hair, she's doing this, she's got tattoos, and she's definitely, and they are definitely expressing gender that we would typically associate with somebody that we've assigned to be a woman, right? There is some masculine qualities going on here, what we would assign to be traditionally masculine, you know, more of a tomboy. But what they've declared by being agender is that they lack the experience of a gender, which is a really difficult thing for me to understand because from my knowledge, I've always experienced a gender. I've always felt I've known what that feels like. I don't know what a lack of a gender would feel like, and I think that's a difficult thing for some of us to contemplate. But that is how they are describing their experience of gender. They also describe themselves as being pansexual. The prefix pan means all, and we'll get more into that a little bit later. But by declaring this or agender, that does not mean anything about what they are describing with their sexual orientation. They're two separate identities. And then they're an American rapper, singer, songwriter. That's how they got famous. All right. Her name is Rain Dove. And she was born biologically female and identifies as a woman. So we would call that a cis woman or cis female. The prefix cis means same. I'll talk more about that in a little bit too. But she often, and probably like 99% of the trainings that I've done, gets mistaken for a man or he or his in that photo. And that is because she is really androgynous. And she was living in New York. She wasn't getting booked as a female model. And so she went into a casting for Calvin Klein for a men's modeling shoot, and they booked her. They're attracted to her androgynous features, and she primarily goes by she's and hers, but she's okay with he's and hims and theys and thems depending on what she's modeling that day. And she's also a really outspoken lesbian. She's got a great blog. If you're curious, just Google Rain Dove. Her story is really interesting. All right. And this is not really a pop star. I don't even know what you would describe. Maybe like kind of like a rock star, a punk star. But his or their name is Gerard Way, and he's the lead singer for My Chemical Romance. Back in 2014, he came out as being what is called non-binary, which is going to mean something different for different non-binary people, and we'll talk about what the binary is in a bit. But Gerard primarily goes by he's and his and also is okay with theys and theirs. So both pronouns are acceptable for this person. And I like what he says. About his gender, I've always identified a fair amount with the female gender and began at a certain point in My Chemical Romance to express this through my look and performance style. Masculinity to me has always made me feel like it wasn't right for me. So he's referring to the essence of gender, this masculinity and this femininity, and what we have determined to be more masculine or more feminine socially. It's Gerard Way. All right. Their name is Jarek Hoffer, and Jarek has come out as being transgender. I've made the slide quite a while ago, but recently they have come out as being trans. And Jarek is an actor and a performer. Jarek acted in different shows in Seattle and that kind of play circuit. But then Jarek also becomes Jinx Monsoon, which is what she's most famous for now. So Jinx is a drag character, and Jinx won season 5 of RuPaul's Drag Race, if you're familiar with that. Drag is more performance, and trans is something that's different than drag. Drag is an exaggeration of gender. So you have drag queens, which exaggerate femininity, drag kings, which exaggerate masculinity. So when Jarek is in drag, and as Jinx, she goes by she's and hers. But when it's Jarek, they go by they and them. So Jarek the person, transgender, they and them. Jinx, she and her. She's really weird. She's a fun one to watch. She's really kind of a quirky drag queen. She's not your traditional drag queen. And then this is Benjamin Melzer. So you said you've seen him before. Yeah, he's a fitness model. And he was born biologically female and has completed his transition to being a man. And I've seen him refer to himself as being transgender, transsexual, or as a trans man, and I'm sure he also just identifies as a man sometimes. I was working with a student who was going through the transition process, born biologically female, and was in this stage of taking hormones and hormone blockers and testosterone. And now that he was going through the process of transitioning, he was like, Pete, am I still transgender or am I now transsexual? And really, and how I responded to him was, well, it's really up to you, however you want to be referred to. You know, this is your chance to label yourself however you want to. It's not up for me or for anybody else to tell you what it needs to be. So I like that Benjamin's more flexible or fluid with the labels that he uses to talk about himself. But he is a man. And he's a model. He's in really good shape. A lot of people would kill for those muscles, man. So now how we're going to frame this and how these people fit into what we're going to talk about today and how we all fit into this is looking at these different spectrums of identity. And I've broken them up into biological sex, sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sexual behavior. And if you get anything out of this or today, I want you to get that these are all distinct, different parts of our identity, and one cannot predict the other. They're interrelated, but they don't all mean the same thing. Now, I have them divided really nice and neatly here. This is a lie. This is not how it is. This is just one interpretation. And I've chosen to do it this way because it's nice and neat and organized. But the reality is, and coming from a place of queer theory, is these binaries don't necessarily exist, and we've created them. And we've tried to fit people into these dichotomous boxes, typically based out of two categories. And what's happening is, within the queer community, is we're saying that we no longer adhere to the structure of how people are organized. It's not inclusive, and it's used to discriminate and be prejudicial towards the queer community and deny us our right to declare our own sexual orientation, gender identity. So I'm using this today as a simple way to explain this to you, but this isn't necessarily how it is, which I know is confusing. That's another thing you're gonna get out of today, is this is confusing. But follow along and we'll go slow and get through them all. So I just wanted to reaffirm that this is just one way to talk about this information. It's coming from a postmodern constructivist perspective, and it's based out of this idea that people have their own truth and lived experiences, and the environment and society shapes them, but only they know what their sexual orientation or gender identity is. And it's up for them to declare it. And it's not going to necessarily fit into these nice boxed categories that we've created, and that have oftentimes been created by people who are in power. Using the spectrums could also be considered a microaggression or a microinvalidation. So when I say microinvalidation, that's like saying to somebody who would say, I'm agender, well, no, you can't be, agender doesn't exist. There's no way you can't have a gender. Or agender doesn't fit into this man-woman thing, this binary. It makes some identities invisible. And not all queer people want to fit onto this nice binary. So just be aware that the spectrums could be considered a microinvalidation or a microaggression. All right, so biological sex. What is biological sex?
How you were born.
How you were born.
Chromosomes.
Chromosomes. Sure. What else? So there's this really interesting study that just came out, and it was looking specifically at disability. And one of the biggest deficits that counselors have around disability is talking about sexuality, specifically sexual health and sexual well-being. And some of these things that we're going to talk about today are related to that, and I think we still get uncomfortable when we talk about sex or use words related to sexuality. So I'm going to encourage you to be uncomfortable and just kind of embrace it. And the best thing you can do is start practicing having challenging conversations and just get used to talking about it. The only way we can build our competency is if we practice, all right? So,
I was going to say genitalia.
yeah.
So I have a nephew who was born without a penis.
Yeah.
You know?
Mm-hmm.
He had a scrotum and he had testes. He had no penis. So I don't think genitalia necessarily describes biological sex.
Sure. Traditionally, it has, but you're correct. So traditionally, the binary for biological sex has been male and female, and those are the two categories that were best known. Female, somebody is born with a vagina. Male, somebody is born with a penis and scrotum. And so a baby would come out and the doctor would look, or doctors look, they see what it is. Oh, it's a boy or it's a girl, but that's not necessarily always the case. So 1 in 2,000 times, it's not 100% a male or 100% a female, but a combination of the two. And that can manifest in a lot of different ways. So you just gave that example of your nephew. I was working with another student at ECU who was born what appeared to be biologically male and went through the process of kind of coming to terms with the fact that she might be transgender. So she came out as transgender and she went to go start the process of transitioning to learn that actually she had an ovary. And I think partial uterus too. But she never knew that, because by all accounts on the outside it looked like she was biologically male. But really, she was intersex, and she had no idea. So Intersex, like I said, they occur at a rate about 1 in every 2,000, and it manifests differently with every intersex person. There are some patterns of intersex development that are more common, but it still can be unique to that person. Traditionally, what would happen is an intersex child would be born, and the doctors would look at the child and they would measure the size of its clitoris, and if it was above 2 centimeters, they would surgically assign that child to male. If it was less than 2 centimeters, they would surgically assign the child to female. However, they could never really predict how that child would develop as an adult. So you could assign somebody to be biologically female at birth. They get to puberty and they have more testosterone hormone in their body. They start to develop facial hair in an Adam's apple, and they had no idea. And oftentimes that was done in a way that was well-meaning, and I think you'll see that a lot is there's something about the majority or the in-group where they want everybody to fit in, and you'll see this with doctors, you'll see this with parents. You want your child to have the easiest life as possible. So you're going to want to assign them to be one of these. But that's not best practice anymore. Now you let an intersex child grow up into an intersex adult and allow them to decide if they would like to transition or not as an adult. And a lot of times they don't. They just remain intersex. Can I ask, did your nephew go through the transition process?
They really argued about whether they should assign him to be a girl or assign him to be a boy, and they decided to let him be a boy. And he grew up as a boy. I mean, he's got testosterone and masculine. He's married to a woman.
All right. And I think as a parent, I'm not a parent, but I would just imagine, one of the fundamental ways that we categorize our society, and we have for thousands of years, is based off of biological sex. It's one of the most basic ways that we separate things and categorize things within our society. So if you have a child that doesn't fit into that, I could see some anxiety around what's going to happen. I mean, what's one of the first questions you usually ask somebody after they have a baby? Is it a boy or a girl, right? And I mean, now we can even find out ahead of time through ultrasound whether the baby is going to be a boy or a girl. So it's usually a pretty big factor in how that baby is going to develop. All right, and now I have 2 other terms up here, which we'll get into a little bit more later, but just to be clear on what they are, MTF stands for male transitioned into female, and female transitioned into male. And this will fall under the transgender umbrella. And we'll talk more about them in a bit, but this is the group of individuals who have gone through the process of gender reassignment and hormone therapy. Any questions about biological sex? It's the most basic one. People have been around forever who are intersex, ever since humans have been around. Intersex people have been around. But New York State in 2016 was the first state to actually put intersex on a birth certificate. Up until then, one of the big pressures of assigning one or the other was we have to put something on the birth certificate. But that's starting to change. All right, so moving on to sexual orientation. What is sexual orientation? What does it feel like?
Who you're attracted to.
Who you're attracted to. How do you know you're attracted to somebody?
Sexual arousal.
Sexual arousal, okay. Yeah, that's a piece of it for sure. What other kind of attraction have you felt before?
Well, as a young boy, I was encouraged to, as an adolescent, I was encouraged, when are you going to date? When are you going to?
Oh yeah.
There's that social, or I'm dating so and so, and so there's a whole social component to that as well.
Yeah. I wonder how much of that too we look at the adults in our lives and see what they're doing, and we mimic them. Yeah. So there's definitely that social piece of who you're attracted to. How else do you experience attraction? Yeah.
I'm drawn to it.
You are. There's like this weird energy.
Yeah.
We're good.
Weird good, yeah. Oh yeah, you feel it when it's good. You also feel it when it's bad.
Right.
And when the attraction is like the opposite, you know, it's like the magnets push apart. Yeah. When did you know what your sexual orientation was?
When did you know or when did you admit it?
And I was confused for a long time.
Okay. Confused.
I wasn't sure who I was attracted to.
Yeah. I was too. All right. So, attraction. When we talk about sexual orientation, what we're talking about is attraction. And I think oftentimes we avoid this subject because when we're talking about sexual orientation, that means that we're strictly going to be talking about sex. And while by standing by my previous comment, we need to talk more about sex, when we're talking about the identity of sexual orientation, it's much more than just physical arousal or sex. We're attracted to each other in lots of ways. There's a lot of different reasons why we want to hang out together or that energy is there. The ones I focus on are physical, romantic, and emotional attraction. These three big things that we experience every day with the people in our lives, the people we have relationships with. And there's lots of other ways that we're attracted to each other. You know, there's intellectual attraction, there's spiritual attraction. If you really dig deep into your relationships and why you like the people that you like, you know, it'll be interesting to see what it is about that you're attracted to. So what are some words that we use to talk about sexual orientation?
Well, when you frame it like that, you get into things, I think, like similar values, sense of humor,
Sure.
you know, all of those kind of components. Given the way that you framed it,
Yeah.
that would be part of the attraction to someone that would be felt.
Yeah, I agree.
But it's gay, lesbian?
So yeah, so attraction's complicated, and it's a lot of these really different things. And then we've simplified it by categorizing it with these little boxes that we cram each other in. And we think we know who people are based on the pre-decided label that has been created for them, oftentimes. So the reason you have this big influx now of these new sexual orientations that you've never heard of before, and you're like, what is this wacky stuff? It's because those people are no longer going with the predetermined social categorized sexual orientations that have been made for them. It's evolved beyond that now. All these labels is a tool for communication. Okay? When people adopt them, that's their way of trying to tell you who they are. So sexual orientation, it's really interesting. I've been doing my chapter 2 for my dissertation, and I'm really digging deep into where do these things come from and how have we come to define them the way we do socially. And we don't know where sexual orientation comes from yet. There's a lot of research, especially from the 90s, but even some more recent research that came out within the last year that has shown a strong likelihood of a genetic component attached to sexual orientation. And then there's also theories who insist that it's actually more of an environmental or psychological process that occurs within a child. The reality is that we don't know, and it doesn't really matter. I always tell my parents it doesn't really, it doesn't matter if it's biological or if it's environmental. Either way, it's your fault. Because I have no control over how I feel or what I'm attracted to. I mean, I've tried to change it. I can't, Just like you all likely couldn't either. They've shown conversion therapy is disastrous. It doesn't work. You can't do it. It's just a part of who we are. So no matter why it is the way it is, we have this broad range of sexual orientation or attraction. So these are the words that we typically use to talk about sexual orientation. So you have hetero, which means like the opposite. Hetero means the opposite. Homo means the same. We did a survey at St. Cloud State before I left, looking at sexual orientation. We're still not allowed to ask that on college applications or anything, but we did some independent research, and we found that a lot of students, instead of clicking the box heterosexual, will click other and write in straight. So that's much more of a common term now that you'll hear, is people describe themselves as straight. And you'll hear less, especially in the US, people who are gay and lesbian describe themselves as homosexual. So looking at our history and the history of homosexuality, it was classified as a mental illness in the DSM up until 1973. And this was used as a term to describe what would be seen as a mental illness. So from a gay rights perspective or a queer rights perspective, it wouldn't make sense for us to adopt this label. It's still used to talk about humans, but not people. And I should say too, for intersex, the term hermaphrodite is typically used to talk about that group of people. That's no longer used within our community. It's seen as derogatory. We talk about animals with that word and with this word, but not people. So within this category of people who are attracted to the same people as them, you have gay, usually men who are attracted to other men, lesbian, usually women who are attracted to other women. You'll have some lesbian women identify as gay. I've never met a gay man that identifies as a lesbian. Anybody? Probably not, no. And the reason that these are so separate is because back in the movements of the 60s and 70s, the lesbian community identified that they had their own unique needs, and the disparity within the lesbian community was much greater than that of the gay community. A lot of that has to do with women's rights and equality. And I always like to look at, whenever you see the acronym, you can always kind of tell how socially aware an organization may be depending on the ordering of the lettering. So if you see GLBT, for example, this is usually the group that gets the most attention politically and in the media, and just within culture in general. When I was at our resource center, we had changed our name to LGBT, so put the lesbian first. If you see BLGT, that's even better, because it's just showing that there's these other groups with just as much disparity and just as much need as the gay community. Just a little something. All right, so you have gay, lesbian, and the largest group of sexual minorities is actually people who identify as bisexual. So the prefix bi means two, or you can think of it as both. And traditionally, what people have viewed the bisexual definition as being is somebody who has the capacity to be attracted to both men and women, right? However, we know that there are more gender categories that exist now than just men and women. So when I say bisexual, I like to think of this as people, I'm attracted to people who are like me, and then also people who are not like me. So two. And just the capacity, and that's an important piece, because oftentimes used against sexual minorities, this idea that because they're a sexual minority, they're going to be attracted to all people who, like, I'm a gay man, so obviously I'm going to be attracted to all men, which is definitely not the case. A lesbian is going to be attracted to all women. Somebody who's bisexual just wants to have sex with as many people as they can because they're attracted to everybody, but that's not how it works. We all have different unconscious, oftentimes, rules to our attraction. We can't control who we're attracted to. Most people aren't attracted to everybody. That'd be a very, very small minority. So that's bisexual identity. There's also an issue within the bisexual community called bi-erasure. And Bi erasure is basically or making invisible somebody's bisexual identity based on what we assume about them, oftentimes by coupling. So let's say I'm a bisexual man, I'm in a relationship with another woman. How would the world view me? It's heterosexual or straight, right? So it essentially would erase my bisexual identity. Or I'm a bisexual woman in a relationship with another woman. We would assume that she's a lesbian, right? Even though she has the capacity to be attracted to more than one. Most of us are monosexual. Bisexuals make up about 5 or 4% of the population. The rest of us are just attracted to one other. It's real simple. And I don't know what it would feel like to be able to be attracted to more than just men. But that is their experience. The highest rate of disparities can be found in the bisexual community, and it's oftentimes because they don't have a place in either the straight world 100% or the gay world. And there's biphobia within both. So oftentimes you'll hear within our community, well, you're just coming out bi on your way to becoming out gay or lesbian. Or, I don't want to date somebody who's bisexual, I don't want to compete with somebody else. And there's also some privilege with the bi identity. So if I am a bisexual man in a relationship with a woman, I'm viewed as heterosexual, we call that passing. But it can come at a cost. I did this training for one of the VR offices in Minnesota, and afterwards one of the counselors came to me and we talked for a while, and she came out as bisexual during the conversation, and she said, you know what, I've been married for 10 years and I have a family, and nobody would ever assume that I'm bisexual, and I haven't talked about this since college, but this is who I am. And I could tell that was really hard for her to not be able to feel like she could be her full self in that setting, in her work setting. But I think it's one of the reasons that you see higher rates of psychological distress within the bisexual community. All right. Pan, the prefix pan means all. So this is the capacity to be attracted to all people, regardless of their biological sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. So again, that doesn't mean that they are attracted to all people, it's just the capacity to be attracted to all people. I like to think of this one as like hearts before parts, or you can think of it as bisexuality with some gender politics mixed in. So somebody who's pan, you know that they have an awareness of the transgender community, so they're likely at least a little bit more educated on queer issues or queer identity. Now, asexual. So I moved this one up and off of the spectrum of attraction, because the prefix a means a lack of. So going back to Angel Hayes, agender, a lack of a gender. Prefix a, asexual, a lack of attraction, which again, that's something difficult for me to understand. It makes up about 1% of the population, and from what they describe is they lack the experience of attraction. But it could be much more complicated than just a blanket lack of attraction. We worked with a student who they identified as something called gray asexual. There's a really great article, it's called 50 Shades of Asexual, and it breaks down all these different ways that people who are asexual describe their experience of sexual orientation. How this student described their experience is that about 99% of the time they never experienced any kind of physical attraction, but there's been a few moments in their life where they felt it, but it just went away. So they're predominantly asexual, but they've experienced attraction, so they know what it feels like, and they also know the absence of it. It's really complex stuff. A lot of us, it's a little bit more simple than that. You can also look at physical, emotional, romantic attraction, and the asexual identity really breaks this down well. So you could have people that identify as aphysical or aromantic, but bi-emotional. So they have the capacity to be emotionally attracted to people. They have felt that kind of attraction, but they haven't felt these other two before. Alfred Kinsey did a really good job breaking this down back in the 40s and 50s. He was a researcher who looked extensively at sexual orientation. And what he found in his research was that we all kind of live on this continuum of sexual attraction, and that only about 3% of the population are 100% straight, and only about 3% are 100% gay, and the rest fall on a spectrum of sexual orientation or attraction. Now, what he's not saying is that 93% of people aren't straight. Like 93% of people, at least in the US, identify as straight. But what he uncovered is these different layers and complexities to sexual orientation and attraction that we didn't really know about before. So like me, for example, I would say that though I identify as gay and I'm exclusively physically attracted to men and romantically attracted to men, I would be bi-emotional. I have a lot of really deep relationships with my girlfriends, with people who are transgender, and I care about them. I love them. I'm attracted to them. They're a part of my sexual orientation experience, but I'm still gay. That's still my primary identity. And I think if you look into your own lives, you might see some similarities. So oftentimes you'll have women say that some of their deepest emotional connections are with other women. Right? Or you'll have men who, we have this new word that we use, it's bromance. So we've now made it socially acceptable for two straight men to have a deep emotional connection or a friendship. It's not so black and white. Now, these other words I put on here, I just kind of put on to scare you a little bit, but not really. I mean, they're not that scary. It's just, there's tons of different terms that are being used. And the reason that I like these three in particular is because they focus on this one aspect of our identity, which is attraction and sexual orientation. So when I say lesbian, socially, how we have defined that is two women who are attracted, or a woman who's attracted to another woman. So that defines somebody's gender as well as their sexual orientation. Right? When I use these words, I'm looking exclusively at sexual orientation. So andro means you're attracted to men. So heterosexual women, gay men, we would both be androsexual. Gynosexual, attracted to women. So lesbian women, straight men would be gynosexual. And then scoliosexual are people attracted to trans folks and beyond. And I like this word too. If you added these two together, it starts androgynous. But again, looking at the prefixes of words and what they mean. So now moving on from sexual orientation, gender. What is gender? Where does it come from? What does it feel like?
I think here you're getting more into some social influence as well. So
Okay.
even going back to babies, you put boy babies in blue and girl babies in pink, and you start, at that time, that's how you identify your gender. And then as you grow up, this is what little boys do, this is what little girls do, and this is your Barbie doll, this is your G.I.
Sure.
Joe, and then you start learning how to express yourself.
So you're looking at the social piece, already starting when we're babies.
Very interesting, like in a daycare setting. So I have a 4-year-old, and it's seeing the different perspectives of different parents. They have like a home living section and a dress up section. And there was actually a parent who told a little boy to take off the dress up clothes and shoes that he was wearing because boys don't wear dresses. I mean, it wasn't
Sure.
even his child, and he was, it's just kind of amazing
Yeah.
that well, at any age, that anyone would tell you what to do, but it is just kind of, I don't know, it's really eye-opening to see
It is. It's
where people are coming from. It's just
it's so. I feel like it's so fundamental to everything we've been taught that it's scary for some people to see it not be followed, the rules not be followed, or the scripts to not be followed. We don't really know how to respond or react to that. And that's where you see a lot of transphobia and homophobia come from, is it's a fear of this isn't right, this doesn't feel right. So parents have a big influence on it. It starts as babies, and that it usually looks like something little girls are taken home from the hospital in pink. We give them what kinds of little toys did you get as girls? Dolls. Yeah. We just got my niece a kitchen set, a vacuum. Yeah.
Some set.
Babies. And how do we talk to little girls?
By squeaky voices.
We do. Yeah, we raise the inflection of our voice when we're working with a girl. My dad, it's been really fun to watch him with my niece. She is 3 now, but when she was a baby, and still, even as a 3-year-old, he will get softer. He's like this big burly construction guy. I wouldn't call him burly, but he's a construction man. He's a simple guy, and he even gets softer. I do it too. It's something that just naturally happens when we're interacting with a little girl. How about little boys? Like, they come home in the hospital in blue. What kind of toys do we give our little boys?
Erector sets.
Record sets?
Erector sets.
Erector sets, building stuff, Lincoln Logs, yeah.
Lego.
John Deere tractor stuff.
Lego.
Legos, yeah. Action figures, sports, guns,
Little footballs.
Yeah. And how we talk to little boys?
boys don't cry.
Boys don't cry, yeah. That's right.
I heard myself say that to my own son. I couldn't believe it. Stop acting like a girl, I said to him.
Yeah. Stop acting like a girl, because that's the worst thing. Little boys can't act like little girls.
My husband told my daughter to quit crying and be tough the other day, and I was like, please stop.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, we have these different scripts like that, though. They need to follow their script. Parents do it, teachers do it.
Peers do it.
Peers are probably the
It's
worst.
7th and 8th graders.
Yes, peers police each other. They're probably the worst.
Yeah, in some ways, the workforce too. It's still there. You expect
Oh yeah,
to show up, dress certain ways,
and act a certain way.
act certain ways.
Yeah, I mean, it's changing. We're seeing some really radical things happen the last couple of years, especially this year. It's changing though. But I read a really interesting study that came out recently, and they took these different groups of people, and groups of 5 college students they were, and it was comprised of, each group had some women and some men in it, and they were all tasked with the same thing. They had to build this model of a Lego set, and they picked that because it's a traditionally more of a masculine thing. And what they found was at the end of the study, they had to rate each other, rate the effectiveness of their group. And the groups that had more women rated themselves less effective than the groups that had more men. So and they found that there was no statistical difference between the men and the women. So even women within that study rated themselves lower if they were working with more women on what's been termed a more masculine type of task. So it's still just ingrained in us. And it's really challenging to change those core beliefs that we've gotten since we were babies. And it often starts even before we're babies. So now you can get an ultrasound, find out the sex of a child, start painting its room, buying its toys, picking out a name that's associated with that gender or that biological sex. And we
Talking to it or its stomach.
Yeah.
Either like it's a little bitch, it's a girl or a boy.
You start planning its whole life, My older sister, like I said, she had a baby and she wanted to raise her gender neutral. That was the big, she's really ambitious. She was just out of college, so I think she was just like, I'm gonna try this. And so we painted the room gray. We had to buy really gender neutral clothes before she was born. But as soon as she came out, she was in pink real quick. And her name's Cora. And we talked to her like a little girl. We dressed her up like a little girl. She likes a lot of little girl things, and we just kind of go along with that. And it's interesting to watch the genderization of my niece and now nephew, and it just happens over and over. We got the scripts, our parents got the scripts, and we'll pass them down to our kids, and they repeat themselves. And oftentimes it just sounds like women are meant to do this, women are expected to do this, and men look like that, they're expected to do that. And what we've created in our society in most of Western countries is a patriarchal system where men have qualities which are more desirable and prized, and women have qualities which are more subordinate and subversive. And those are the expectations that we have. And that's still reflected today. When I did one of these trainings in Minnesota, there was a very pregnant woman, and she had already had some kids. And she just said, you know what, I'm expecting a little girl, and I really want to raise my little girl as a little girl. And what's wrong? What's so wrong with that? And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with raising our children in a system like this. What's wrong is that the system is inequitable. And the system is set up in a way which keeps women more subservient and subversive than men, or submissive than men. It's kind of like, do it, but do it mindfully. Be aware of what you're doing. Try to instill messages that are going to allow them to be more equal and less of the power differentiation. Okay, so we talked a lot about the social piece. That's the social piece. Starts as children, goes into adults. We all express gender as adults, and you can see it all the time. You're all expressing it right now. I'm expressing it. It's in what we're wearing. It's in our hair. It's how we talk. It's what we talk about. It's often how we walk. Notice it. It's everywhere. So we carry that. But there's another piece of gender that is beyond just the social construction of gender. And it's an internal psychological feeling of gender. And we know this because there are some individuals who are born in a biological sex that's different than their psychological gender. They don't match. What do we call that group of people? What do we call that group of people whose biological sex is different than their psychological gender? Or that internal feeling of gender?
Transgender?
Yes. Transgender. Yeah. So while gender is social, you can really think of gender identity as being I always say between the eyes. So biological sex is between the thighs, gender identity is between the eyes. And it's how we feel in the world. I feel like a boy, like a man. That works for me, it fits. Not all of it, but that's how I am. For some people, it doesn't work like that. So this is our binary that we're using to talk about this. You have masculinity on one side, femininity on one side. We all have a balance of both within us, but we are taught to stamp one or the other out. And we often do that through policing off peers, adults, whatever. And it's interesting, these two are separate, but we use sexual orientation oftentimes to police gender. So if you have a boy who's acting more feminine, we'll call him queer, faggot, gay, even though his gender identity and expression is not related to sexual orientation. But we've conflated the two. So masculine, feminine, cis, the prefix cis means same. And all this means is someone's biological sex is on the same side as their gender identity. So somebody who's born male identifies as a boy or a man. Somebody who's born female identifies as a woman or a female, or a woman or a girl. People who are trans identify in an opposite manner. The prefix trans means across, so you can think of transgender as like a cross gender, like transcontinental, across gender or transcending gender. And this is also an umbrella term similar to queer, which encompasses a whole array of other identities. And this is just a few of them. I'm not being inclusive to all the identities that are out there. These are just some of the more common ones that you'll hear. So trans makes up approximately, anywhere from 0.3 to 1.3% of the population. The jury's out on that. We'll never fully know how many people identify as trans because it's something that needs to be declarative. Much like sexual orientation, trans or gender minorities are invisible minorities. You would not know for sure unless somebody tells you what their identity is. So we'll never know exactly how many people are trans because you have to come out as trans. But right now, the estimate hovers around 1%. People who are trans can start to articulate that as early as the ages of 3 or 4. It's like about the same time that we acquire language. And for people working in VR or within mental health, trans is the gender dysphoria diagnosis that you'll see in the DSM. So when you're working with somebody who's transgender, you'll see gender dysphoria. And that was recently changed in the DSM-5 from gender identity disorder. And they did that intentionally because they don't want to associate it with, they no longer want to associate it with a mental illness, but rather the psychological disparities that typically are that come with the gender dysphoric identity or the trans identity. So the criteria to diagnose somebody as trans, it's a process. And oftentimes it's going to be different and vary from state to state, but typically what's going to happen is that they are going to need the approval of a medical doctor and also the signed approval of a therapist that's been working with them for at least 1 to 2 years, and saying that they are ready to transition. What's happening now is a new generation of children are starting to transition as early as like 7, 8, 9. And they're the first kind of crop of children who are getting to go through this process. Now, it's when I say that, it's a little scary because you think, well, when somebody transitions physically through gender assignment surgery or hormone replacement surgery, it's a permanent thing, and it's doing real changes to your body. However, if a child is trans, the criteria for them to be diagnosed as trans is much more difficult to be diagnosed as trans as a child than it is as an adult. So there's more standards, or criteria is the word I'm looking for. Criteria. Oftentimes, children play around with gender, so this can be a little bit confusing. She brought up the example of a little boy in a dress. When I was younger, I used to like to wear my neighbor Molly's Dorothy red slippers. I would wear them all the time. And my parents never let me wear them to school, but I loved them, And I played dress up with her, and I liked to try different things. It's normal for kids to play around with gender if they're exploring. A child who's transgender is going to be really insistent and persistent that they're in the wrong body. They will say things like, I'm on the wrong body, I am not a boy, I am not a girl, and will continue. There will be distress that you will experience. So what's nice about starting the transition process early is it allows them to forego the experience of puberty, which can be really traumatic in the body that is not their own or is not right for them. So they can get on hormone blockers, they can start taking the hormones that they need, testosterone or estrogen, and it'll make the experience a lot smoother and less painful. It's much more invasive the later you wait in life to get surgery for transitioning. And not everybody will transition. So the 2 examples I have up here, male to female, female to male, these are the people that are transitioning biologically through gender reassignment surgery or hormone replacement. You can think of people like Caitlyn Jenner or Chaz Bono. Those are the 2 popular examples. But not everybody is going to go through this process, and some people will remain in their biological body or do a partial transition. So I worked with a student who identified as genderqueer, and they were born biologically female, identified as genderqueer, and were taking hormones, testosterone specifically, to embrace more of their masculinity. And that's as far as they had planned to go through the transition process. You'll also have people who cannot come out as trans. So trans is still something that's really kind of misunderstood within our culture. Again, it's changing and becoming much more prevalent, more well known, but it still might not be safe necessarily for somebody to come out as trans. So we also worked with a student who was born biologically male. We'll call him Mark. And Mark would come into the resource center, and he expressed himself in a really masculine way. So he was in the Marines. He came from a long line of people who served in the Marines. And when he turned 18, he also wanted to serve in the Marines. So he started that process, got a wife, had some kids, and he would come in. And when Mark was in the resource center, psychologically, Mark was a woman. Mark was married. I say Mary. So we would encounter this person and see Mark, a hyper-masculine Marine, but really, internally, Mark is Mary, and she might not ever come out beyond just a few people because she's scared of the repercussions of what might happen. So trans isn't always that neat, tidy package of transitioning to the opposite sex or biological sex. It could look a lot different. I used the word genderqueer earlier, and genderqueer is another label that's being more commonly used, and it really could be defined differently for each person who uses that label. If you see somebody identify themselves as genderqueer, the best thing you could do is just ask, what does that mean for you? In fact, that's probably true for any of these. You know, what does that mean for you to be genderqueer? What does that mean for you to be trans? Have them articulate it and explore it. All right, and then these are a few other terms that I encourage you to just explore and look up. We're not going to go through all of them, but there are, like I said, hundreds. Any questions about gender identity or expression? Okay. And then the one I say for last is sexual behavior. And I saved it for last because it's the least likely predictor of what somebody's sexual orientation or gender is. But oftentimes we equate everything into sexual behavior. So I don't really care for Caitlyn Jenner, but going back to Caitlyn Jenner, when she was Bruce and started going through the transition process, there was this big push in the media to think like, well, wait, Bruce was always married to a woman, so does that mean Bruce is now a lesbian? You know, one, it doesn't matter, you know, but we have this obsession of knowing who people are having sex with because we think that's what defines them. I did this training once, and there was a woman who identified as a lesbian, and she had been married to a man for 10 years. I mean, I didn't ask about her sex life, but most people would be like, well, she has got to at least be bisexual. And it's like, well, no, I mean, she's identifying as a lesbian. So the best that we can do from a postmodern perspective is just affirm that, you know. That's great. It doesn't matter. Oftentimes, especially in the literature or the research, you'll see a group of people called men who have sex with men. And these are straight men who don't identify as gay, but they engage in sexual behavior with other men. You know, their sexual behavior is just that, it's a behavior. You don't have to have attraction necessarily for the behavior to exist. All right. Okay, so now what I would like you to do is take a few moments and actually take out a piece of paper. You're gonna do some writing, some free writing, and I want you to sit with this for a little bit. And I want you to think back on your own lived experience. Okay? Just some free writing, whatever comes to mind. We're gonna take 10, 15 minutes. And I want you to go back to the place you grew up, the town you grew up in, the house you grew up in, your family. What was your family like? What were the politics in the house? Was there religion in the house? Who are your friends? Okay? Go back to that place. And now think about the first time that you remember having a conversation about sex. Think about the first person you ever had a crush on, or the first person that you ever felt attracted to. Think about that first time where you were told you had to do something just because it was your gender and you didn't want to do it, but you did it anyway. And remember what that felt like. So just take a few moments and write. All right, so now we've done a little bit of processing, and at home you've taken some time to really think about these different parts of yourself and what your development has been like. There's some intention behind this, and a lot of it is because oftentimes people in the majority group, specifically heterosexuals and cisgender people, have never really had to consider their own sexual and gender development, and that's a privilege. I can tell you very clearly where I was and what I was doing when I realized that I was gay. And it was scary for me because I was growing up in a household in isolation by myself as far as role models or LGBT people, and that's a really common experience, and that's something that is relatable for people with disabilities and for people who are queer. There's that familial isolation. They don't have those role models to teach them. Oftentimes people who are heterosexual or cisgender, they're just always doing what's been expected of them, and that's normal. They've never really had to think about it. But in order to relate to our consumers who identify differently than us, it's important to think back, how was this for me? How would I be different if I was in this person's shoes? It's developing empathy for their lived experience. Okay. All right. So thank you for humoring me with that. How much time do I have left?
35 minutes.
Yeah? Great. So we have to start talking about disability. So, somebody in the audience said that was really like writing about coming out. And what you just did was essentially your own coming out process. And one of the privileges of being heterosexual or cisgender is that you don't have to come out because you always have been what's been expected of you. Coming out is a lifelong process. I came out for the first time, I was outed for the first time about 10 years ago. And I've had a continual coming out since. Every time I meet somebody new, you have to decide whether they're a safe person to come out to. And so oftentimes what happens is people in the queer community are looking for cues when they interact with somebody to determine whether this person is a safe person to come out to. So I'm from Minnesota, and I recently moved to a southern state, and it's a little bit more Republican. Minnesota's a pretty progressive place. And I went to the dentist recently, and I was sitting there, and there was a really nice dental technician, and she was about to take out 3 of my fillings, and so I was not happy to be there. But she was trying to make me feel better because I hate the dentist. And she started asking me about my girlfriend, who I was dating. And at that moment, I could choose, well, is this a person that I want to come out to and explain, well, actually, no, I'm gay, or do I just keep my mouth shut and act like I don't have anybody? And at this point, I didn't say anything because I don't really know who this person is. And they're about to be in my mouth I was there for like 2 hours. It was terrible. But this is something that happens whenever we interact with somebody. And as somebody who's been out for 10 years, I'm usually pretty out. I come out and do these trainings, like pretty open about my identity, but there are still instances where it might not feel safe to do so. So if somebody comes out to you or explains their sexual orientation, that's them showing that they trust you and they trust your reaction. And that can be a really difficult thing sometimes, especially when the person is somebody close to us and somebody we've always thought of in a different way. So a sibling or a parent or a friend, somebody we've known for years, they choose to come out to us. That could be really hard to hear. But remember, they came to you because they trusted you, they trusted your reaction, and how you respond is going to dictate how they move forward in the coming out process. So if you respond in a way that is negative and not validating to what they just told you, it can be really detrimental to the rest of their development. And that's where we see a lot of psychological distress come from in terms of coming out. So that's where things like mood disorders, substance abuse disorders, eating disorders come from, oftentimes, with this process. Once somebody does come out, and if you're working with somebody who has come out recently or a consumer, whether they're gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender, but specifically transgender, it's important to get them involved with their community and people who are like them. Because like I was saying before, oftentimes they grow up in isolation, they don't have role models, they don't know how to interact with the world. And research has shown that the resiliency within communities can be helpful to the well-being of queer individuals. And now we can finally start talking about disabilities. So I put congenital versus acquired disabilities down here because I'm curious what you all think would be the difference for coming out for somebody who has a congenital versus somebody who has an acquired disability. What are some of the challenges of coming out for somebody who has a congenital disability?
A person with a congenital disability doesn't have all the I'm not normal or I'm different or all those issues that a person with an acquired disability has.
Sure.
So the person with a congenital disability, I'm deaf or whatever, that issue is resolved. So in a way, for want of a better term, I'm like an able-bodied person who decides to come out.
Okay.
Whereas a person with an acquired disability, you've just gotten this very complicated. But a person with an acquired disability who's not out has to deal with the disability issues of now my life is different than it was before, and how am I going to get to work, or how am I going to support myself, or whatever the issues are. In addition to it would be more multiplicative because the individual has to deal with the issues of coming out in addition to
Sure.
dealing with the disability. So I don't think it's easy for either one. I'm not saying it is.
What if they have autism or they're autistic?
But you throw in autism or any type of cognitive impairment,
Yeah.
then you just put a whole nother layer of issues.
It's important. And I can't tell you how many times I've done this for like a direct support professional type of role or a skills trainer, and they bring up, they have an autistic client or intellectually disabled client, and they don't believe this person because of their disability. They think it's the disability, or they're attention seeking. It comes up a lot. Oftentimes people with congenital disabilities have to rely more on their family for care, especially when they're younger. So at least until they get to 18. And if their family isn't allowing them, if it's a religious or conservative household or even a liberal household, then they're just scared for the well-being of their child. It might be difficult for that child to embrace a queer identity. We were working with one girl just north of Minneapolis a little bit, and she had spina bifida. She came out as a lesbian. She was doing some skills training with my friend Erin, and Erin was so upset one day because she had come out to him. She had come out to her parents, And she just wanted to go meet other lesbians and start getting involved in the community, but they wouldn't let her. They wouldn't let her leave. They wouldn't transport her to where she needed to go. So autonomy plays a factor here too. There's also that, we talked a little bit about this earlier, but just that terrible, not stigma, but stereotype that people with disabilities are asexual, or I don't know what we call that, like a myth. But we desexualize them. We don't regard that part of who they are. And I agree with you with the acquired disability. So here you have somebody who has to go through the experience of internalized ableism, the loss of functioning, and then also they are involved, it's multiple minority stress. They're also a part of another minority group. And there's ableism within the queer community, for sure. There's also homophobia and transphobia within the disability community. All right. So coming out can be different for different people. Okay, now just take a few minutes again and think about what you did last weekend or what you're going to do this weekend. And I want you to just think about it. Maybe say it out loud if you're at home. It's easier to say these things out loud. And talk without using any kind of gender signifiers, no pronouns, like no he, she's, no hims, no names that are closely associated with gender, like Steve or Mark or Mary or Martha. No grandma, grandpa, uncle. And just talk for a couple minutes and see what it's like to do that. Okay, so what about doing this? Like, what did you notice doing this?
It was hard to do it.
Yeah, it's hard.
I just substituted person.
Nice, person, okay.
I just, I stayed home with this person.
Okay,
And this person and I watched television.
yeah,
And we were snowed in, and so this person and I walked in the snow. And that's how I did.
sounds like a great time.
It was a good time. That person really seemed to enjoy it.
This is tough. It gets really vague, and you have to think about it. You have to be really intentional with what you're saying. And you can't really share your full self or your full life. Especially when you're on the job, going to work. We spend a lot of our time at work and with coworkers. We want to interact. We want to be social. That's a piece of it. But it's difficult if you can't share who you are. And if you're always thinking about it really closely, or you're policing your thoughts, that can take a toll on you. That's a lot of psychological distress to go through. Oftentimes people who are in the closet, they have higher rates of anxiety, higher rates of depression, and it's related to this constant policing that they have of what they say, how they talk, their behavior, their mannerisms. They got to be really careful because they're trying to pass. So this is just to give you a taste of what it might be like to be in the closet, or for what a consumer to be in the closet would be like if they were on the job or talking to their parents. You leave with this feeling of like you're lying. And we've been told from a really early age, it's not okay to lie. But we're expected to anyway. It's like the lie is better than the truth for some people. Cognitive dissonance. Okay, so for counseling, just looking at queer competency. Queer competency is something that is a deficit in most counseling professions. And no research has been done yet with rehab counselors looking at queer competency, but what has been looked at has shown that trainings and workshops help increase it. So just by going to things like this and listening and thinking, this should hopefully help with your awareness and knowledge. Also, and this is important too, several studies have shown that the more trainings you've gone to, the more people you know who are queer, and the more direct clinical experience you have, will increase your competency. So I encourage you to get to know some of your queer coworkers or your queer neighbors or your queer consumers. Get to know them, understand what their lives are like and how they might be different than yours. And what we're doing today is building multicultural self-awareness. So the queer community is a part of the multicultural identities. You have race, ethnicity, veteran status, religion, socioeconomic status, disability, and queer is one of them. So a part of this, which we've been doing today, is self-exploration and introspection. So understanding yourself, where your beliefs and your thoughts come from, why you feel the way you do. If this has made you uncomfortable, go back and think, like, what is it about this that made me uncomfortable? What messages have I internalized that make me feel this way? And I bet you'll be able to come up with a few things. And the point of this is to develop more empathy and understanding for how people have experienced their lives, why they are the way they are, and looking at our own internal biases, specifically implicit bias. So, we've come a really long ways as far as the queer movement and the queer community, and we've gotten some more rights in the last few years. However, bias is really insidious, and oftentimes the things that we've learned from a really young age will be embedded with us forever. So a part of this process of being aware is consistently checking yourself. How implicit bias works is it's associated with our associative memory. So our associative memory stores things, images, messages, stereotypes, things that we have learned as children, and it impacts our behavior, whether it's facial gestures, mannerisms, how we feel when we encounter somebody who we're attached to these things. So no matter how much you learn about the queer community or disability, your associative memory will always have these messages embedded within it. And that's just the reality. The reason I'm showing you this is just to reinforce the fact that you need to continually reteach yourself and relearn. You're never fully queer competent. I'm not either. This gets compounded when you have more identities on top of the other. So multiple minority status. Somebody has a disability, African American, woman, and she's a lesbian. Multiple forms of marginalization, oppression, and discrimination. The more complex somebody's identity is, the more disparities they're going to have, and potentially the more support they're going to need. And that's going to look different for different combinations of minority groups. But in terms of these two, there's a lot of fun. There's a lot of interesting overlap between queer theory and disability theory. And we share a lot of similarities within our identities. So a common thing that we share together is this discrimination from the out-group. And it's hypothesized that this is coming from a conscious and unconscious rejection of both disability or queer individuals. So there is some fear attached to disability related to our own fragility. So we're going like real deep right now, but I just want to kind of explain the mechanisms of how this works. But it's this idea that disability represents our own mortality. So when we see it, we just have this initial, and that's something that is ingrained in us. You just keep relearning and keep, reprogramming yourself. And with sexual orientation, typically it looks a little bit different. With sexual orientation, there is a fear of, how do I describe this? So a racist man can never wake up one day and be, a racist white man can never wake up one day and be African American, But a heterosexual man could wake up one day and realize he's been in denial his whole life and be gay. So similar to how we all have the potential to have a disability, there's some potential fluidity within our sexual orientation, I mean, even potentially our gender, that is scary for some people. And that's where they think that a lot of this fear comes from. So it's that shared idea that, people could one day be like us. We're the other. Oftentimes, the fear is expressed through anger and aggression, which is exaggerated. All right, so just some more commonalities. We talked about familial isolation, and I think this is a really important one. Growing up, I'm from a little small farm town in Minnesota. I didn't have any gay role models. We had, a couple women that were roommates that lived in town, and that's how we referred to them. And all my role models I saw on TV, like in the real world, in the show Queer as Folk. That's all I knew. I didn't even know most of these other identities existed until I got to college, which is really common for people in rural areas. It's changing now with the internet and social media. People are coming to college or getting into adulthood with a lot clearer idea of who they are, but they still may experience this familial isolation. And that's the same with somebody with a disability. Oftentimes they may be the only person in their family who has that disability, and it may reshape their whole family or break up their family. There's this shared experience of isolation. Both groups experience higher rates of violence and sexual violence. Lesbian and bisexual women have some of the highest rates of sexual assault, and that goes for a lot of people with disabilities as well. It's a vulnerable population. You experience higher rates of violence and sexual violence. All have a shared experience of different kind of stereotypes, discrimination, and trauma. This idea of passing, disclosure, and coming out. We have this conversation with our consumers. When are you going to choose to disclose to your employer that you have a disability? You're going to choose not to. How are you going to have that conversation? That's similar with somebody who is queer. Transgression and flaunting. So this idea of how, as a queer disability community, we can fight back against the man. So, really emphasizing someone's queerness or someone's disability, like it be more like pride in who they are. Exclusion, so being excluded from different aspects of culture or society. You see that less now with the queer community because of, we legalized gay marriage, but you'll still see that within the disability community, especially in terms of like just access. Commercialization of the queer culture. And so this is something that we differ a little bit on. Like the queer community has kind of found its momentum as a unified movement and support, and it's become commercialized. And the disability community hasn't really figured out how to do that yet. And there's still a lot of different separation between the different disability groups. There isn't like a unified symbol. I mean, when you think of a disability symbol, what do you think of? Parking, right, parking. It's not like the pride flag. So that's something that hopefully the disability community can evolve into. Because I think that while this has been a little bit destructive to queer culture, it's also helped gain us some acceptance within Middle America. This idea, and we heard a little bit about this today, but defining who you are for yourself instead of having somebody to define it for you. So within the disability community, oftentimes things are coming from a medical model, and we are telling people that this is what's wrong with you, this is who you are, we're going to work at either making you better or fixing you, or figuring out how we can arrange your life where it's easier. We still put the disability in the person. Rehab does a good job of being more social and person-centered, but this constructivist idea is more of how can they define themselves for who they are. Like, I don't have a disability, There's a really fun blog I read. It's a feminist blog, and she had this really long article about how she doesn't agree with person first language. She has spinal cord injury. I think it was like a C5 or something. And she talked about how she's disabled. She's disabled by society. She's not a person with a disability. She has been disabled because society hasn't granted her access. And they've excluded her. And I found that really empowering. And it's her defining for herself what her label is and who she is. Much like you see with sexual orientation and gender identity. And validating that. Like the DSM doesn't say that, but okay. Assimilation is politics. So this idea of, do we want to just be accepted and integrated, or do we want to change the whole system? And queer theory comes from a place of get rid of the system. The system is broken and it's oppressive, and it always has to have people down and people up. And then problematizing categories, binary categories. So like we just did all these binaries for sexual orientation and gender. You could do the same thing with disability and different disabilities. Are the categories helpful or are they more harmful? All right, so you will see higher rates of disability within the queer community than in the general population. You'll see things like heart disease, obesity, especially with lesbian women and bisexual women, rates of depression, anxiety, and PTSD, and then substance dependence, and that's for most queer identities. And then in rehab, queer individuals have reported high rates of unemployment and workplace discrimination based on their sexual orientation or gender identity. And within the rehab literature, rehab field, we've kind of neglected them as far as a minority group, and it's focused more on race and ethnicity. To be fair, we don't ask about sexual orientation when we're doing intakes and things, but I think that it's important for us as a counseling profession to give this the attention that it needs. And just the only study that I could find where they actually looked at how many people were accessing VR services found about 28% of queer people with disabilities were using VR services. It was a really small sample, so the number is likely much higher. In terms of employment, these are the states that still do not have employment discrimination to protect queer consumers. So it's more than half of the states. They do not have a state policy that says, that requires places of employment to not discriminate based on sexual orientation and gender identity, which is pretty insane to me, that we would push so hard for same-sex marriage but not the equality of our rights. So that's something to be aware of, especially if you live in some of these states. And specifically, people who are trans. So about 50% of people who are trans are unemployed. It's a really high number. And oftentimes it's because of there's a lack of education of the employers. Some issues that we've come across, at least when I was working with Minnesota VR, gender expression and company dress policies. So when you're doing job placement for your trans consumer, what are they going to be able to wear when they're on the job? Are they going to have to, do they have a uniform that everybody wears? Or are they going to be expected to dress in a specific gender? That's something to think about. We were working with this one person who identified as Two-Spirit, and Two-Spirit is common to the American Indian culture, and it's this idea that people have a balance of both masculine and feminine within them. And he had a beard, he had long fingernails, but he would wear dresses, and he'd wear like combat boots. Like, he really messed with how he expressed himself, but that's how he felt, and that's who he was. And he wasn't willing to compromise getting placed at a job where he couldn't express that. So where can we find places where they'll be able to express how they need to for themselves? Pronouns. What pronouns are they going to use? Are they going to decide to come out before they start the job or after they start the job? And that's something that you can help talk them through. There is a really helpful study that I read, and it surveyed a bunch of different trans people who had been employed, and they talked about helpful and harmful experiences while transitioning. And some of the big things that they talked about were having conversations with the manager or supervisor before they even got started at work, or before they even started the transition process, to see how people would respond. A lot of times they would still report negative outcomes from transitioning or from being trans, but that was something that they suggested. They also suggest looking at the policies, the specific policies of whatever company you're working for. So your state doesn't have trans protection, but does the company that you're going to be placing them at have trans protection? I think that's important to look at. Also, what kind of insurance do they offer? Do they offer medical leave if somebody is planning to transition? Just some things to think about. Oftentimes, experiences come from lack of education. So, will your consumer have to educate their employer on what it means to be trans? Can you help them with that? Can you bring somebody in? Bring somebody from a university, have them come in, educate the workplace. Is that a possibility? Those are all things that could help. And then, of course, supporting them during the transition process and coming out. Do they want to come out while they're working, or do they just want to pass? What's going to be best for them? Okay, so as we kind of wrap and come to a close, I hope you can see how complex this is and how complicated it can be beyond just somebody having a disability. And your role or potential role in helping affirm this person for who they are, especially in regards to sexual orientation and gender identity, because they might not be getting it from anywhere else. So how can we create a space for them where they can trust us and they're willing to share and allow us to support them? I think that's what this is about. So again, continually just going back and re-educating, looking at what makes you uncomfortable and what your biases are, and working so you don't put them on somebody else. You can help them. I think my contact information is with this. So if you come across a question or if there's something you need more clarity about, I encourage you to email me, and I encourage you to continue going to trainings, and thanks for taking the time to listen today.